So Buy Bars, are you the one that's going to take us live?
Looks like we're recording now.
Yeah, we're recording. Okay, great. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I would like to call today's meeting of the Tax Review Commission to order. Looks like we are here. Most of us are here. Murray, if it's possible, can you put yourself on the screen? If you can't, that's okay, but it's always nice if we can see everybody who is on the commission live and in person. I would like to acknowledge that this month we have public testimony. The testimony came in from Beverly and Michael Powers. And Seth, is that distributed to all members?
Yes.
And it will be posted on the website?
Correct.
Okay, so thank you. I am not otherwise going to go through that testimony. So let's move on to the minutes of the meeting of January 20th. I know everybody got it, got copies of the draft. Are there any corrections? All right, then may I have a motion to accept the minutes as distributed?
Motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Murray. And a second from Scott. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carried. We have approved those minutes. So, commission members' communications with stakeholders. Any?
Beth, I just had that one that I logged into that Google spreadsheet that you have from a while back. After our last meeting, Peter Fritz contacted me. I guess he was listening in and he heard my discussion about on the last meeting about the retirement tax, how pensions versus 401ks, Social Security not being taxed and so forth. And he heard that discussion. So he gave me a call and just wanted to let me know that was discussed in the 2000 Tax Review Commission. And he pointed me to one of the commissioners at the time that had some opinions on that if I wanted to contact him to get more information.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Anybody else? Okay, well, in that case, let's move on to item number 5, the presentation on the TAT and property tax. Seth, I believe that is you.
Great. Let's see, let's do this. Okay, you guys should see the whole screen, right? It's not a smaller portion of the screen.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, great. So today I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about the TAT, which is the Transient Accommodation Tax. I'm going to talk about property tax. And then at the very end, I threw in a little discussion about tax saliency, because I think it's at least over the last decade, I would say it's like this emerging sector of behavioral economics as it relates to taxation. I thought it would be interesting for you guys to think about it as well. So I'm going to begin with the Transient Accommodation Tax. Just as we go over things, the Transient Accommodation Tax it's levied on the gross rental proceeds derived from furnishing transient accommodations for anything less than 100 consecutive days, right? So 6 months or less. Currently it's at 10.25%. That's for the Transient Accommodation Tax. We also have the Timeshare Occupancy Tax, which in the last, I would say, 8 years, that those rates were different, but they have since converged. One of the things that some people bring up, it often occurs in the legislature, is to think about how timeshares are taxed, right? And if they're taxed in proportion to what the TAT is, right? So if you own a timeshare, you're not, in reality, you're not renting anything, right? So what are you paying on? So they have these gross daily maintenance fees, which is essentially cleaning and things like that. Right now it's on 50% of the gross daily maintenance fees. Oftentimes they suggest that it goes up to 100, right? So this is the idea here, and the economic or the rationale behind this bill is that, you know, since they own the underlying, or they own the rights to the underlying asset, they should only be paying the TAT on the services that are involved in providing resort accommodations. Whether some people have contested that 50% is probably too low, right? And it should at least be 100% of the things, but that's just something to think about, and that often comes up into a tax policy whenever it comes to TAT. Does anybody have any questions about that?
Yeah, just real quick, Seth.
Mhm.
Does this, maybe you're gonna get into this later, does this TAT, and I probably should know this, does it cover Airbnbs, vacation rental by owners, that type of thing?
Yes, yes. So covers everything. I'm not going to get into this, but I'll talk about it right now. And if you guys want to have a deeper discussion about it, we can. The view, it's Airbnb transient vacation units are, of course, a very hot topic here in Hawaii. The Department of Taxation has always taken the stance that irrespective of whether they're legal or illegal from a land use perspective, which is a county issue, these people are obligated to pay their taxes on the TAT and GET, which if you are renting out a house several couple $100 a day, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars of taxes a year. We have made or we do have ongoing efforts to make, we have the special enforcement unit, which looks at this sector and ensures that the transient vacation units are compliant with existing tax law. So yeah. Any other questions about that? Okay. So TAT collections is the third largest source of revenues for the state. It is also the fastest growing. There's two reasons for that. One is, you know, over the past decade, we've seen a large increase of tourists, and also is, and I kind of joke facetiously, is they don't vote, right? So this is probably the tax that is most likely to get increased out of all of our taxes, because they don't represent Hawaiian voters, right? And so the best people to tax is always somebody that's not in your constituency. And what you can see is TAT has grown more rapidly than GET. So this is like a normalized number, which means, like, you know, we're just starting everything at 1, so we can see it relative. It was gone up, and gone up. Now, if I didn't include anything about calendar year 2020 in any of this presentation, just because we shut off the tourism economy, and if anything, all this stuff would just plummet, right? Here's the TAT. You can show the increases over the years. It was started in 1986 to help fund the convention center, and has taken a larger and larger and larger role ever since. So the most recent one was a 1% tax increase, and that went to the Mass Transit Fund, which helps support the rail in Oahu. This is the distribution. So you can see the most of it goes to the general fund now. $103 million goes to the counties. $79 million goes to tourism special fund, the mass transit fund. Now, this is what's really interesting about the TATs. Most taxes, they're levied on a percentage of revenues and things. For the TAT, there's a lot of fixed allocations. The only thing that's not a fixed allocation is the mass transit fund. So this could grow, this can grow, these do not, right, without legislative approval. Then you have these smaller funds right in there. There's like 600 in fiscal year 2019, it was $626 million. It's a large amount. Under the current emergency proclamations, We are not, other than the Mass Transit Fund, we are not, or the governor has decided not to allocate TAT funds to any of these special funds right now. So Hawaii's room rates, I would say when you look at them, Hawaii is a little different in that we levy things at the state level versus most room taxes are levied at the city and county level. However, if you look, I just brought this up, really our room taxes, it's rare that you include, apply your sales tax to a room tax, but we do here because we tax services through our GET. So our room tax is really 4.25%, right? And I wanted to rank that within different cities to see where we were and do different things. And what you see is, you know, when you look at just on the left hand, this is just at the state level. We're at kind of the high end, but if you actually look at the city level, this goes up a little bit because of the 0.5% county surcharge, but you know, we're 58th. This is looking at a rank of 150 cities, so we're basically 2/3 up the way. But you know, there's definitely other cities and other large jurisdictions that have higher tax rates, TAT rates than Hawaii.
With all due respect to Omaha, I find that rather surprising that they have the highest.
They have great steaks. Okay. And then this, I haven't done this recently. However, you know, like the question always arises is when we raise TAT, is that going to shoo away visitors, right? And it does not, when you look at like, this is not statistical, this is not robust, but just looking at the increases, these two marks right here are 1% increases in the TAT, and tourism goes up and up and up, right? So you just don't, at least right now at these current levels, it's not having a detrimental effect on visitor behavior. There's two possible reasons for this. One is the hotels are passing it on to consumers, and consumers just can handle that. The other potential is hotels are already charging as much as they possibly can, and they will be, since they're, or the optimal price. And so if hotels would have to decrease their room rates in order to accommodate the TAT, right? And we don't have a lot of answer for that, but that's what we call tax incidence, right? And who in reality pays for the tax? Is it the consumer or is it the business? In this case, I do not know, but you can make a decent argument either way. But it's important to think about those things, right? Because if the business was going to absorb most of it, you could actually increase the TAT even more, and they would just be lowering their prices. So you're just taking away business profits away if you raise the TAT. If it was borne mostly by consumers, then you know you really would be driving down demand for the product. TAT tends to be more volatile than GET, which is understandable because it's one particular industry, which is the tourism industry. Again, you look at these black lines show 1% increases in GET, and they don't, it's very hard to see a relationship between an increase in tourism or actually, no, it's easy to see an increase in GET and an increasing revenues, right? So when you increase the rate, makes sense, makes more revenues. This is the TAT tax liability broken down by county. And what you see here is Hawaii brings in about 13%, Kauai 11, Maui 30 on average, and Oahu 46. This is slightly changed in recent years. Maui's become a larger and larger source of the TAT revenue, and Oahu has come down a little bit. Now, I matched this against the TAT allocations, and what you'll see is if you look at this, Maui is the one that's furthest away from the amount of TAT generation versus their allocation. So that's it for TAT. It's pretty reasonable. I just wanted to go through it. How does it work in economic efficiency? Yeah, at current rates, it does not appear to be affecting visitors' decisions to come to Hawaii. It is an exported tax. We assume that 92% of all TAT is paid by non-residents. We're in the way I look at it is tourism's our oil, right? So we would expect to have higher levels of taxation on tourism just because people are paying to come here no matter what, right? And that is our comparative advantage. And we can tax it in unique ways. Fairness, it's reasonably progressive, meaning that, you know, people who are vacationing are more likely to pay TAT, and so low income people are less likely to vacation. Administrative burden is relatively low compliance. That got a little harder to do with Airbnb and on the VRBOs. However, the department seems to be getting a better and better handle on that. TAT tends to be more volatile, especially if you shut down your tourism industry. However, it has been rising over recent years. Does anybody have any questions about TAT? Easy. So I include property tax. So the state, due to the state's constitution, the state does not have a purview over property tax. You know, the TRC is makes recommendations to the state legislature. So this is really outside the purview of the TRC in some ways. However, I do think it's important because when you're thinking about taxation at the state and local level, property tax is essential, right? It's a key component of a state and local tax revenue in the United States. And economists generally really like property taxes. And I'll get to that why in a little bit, but I just thought it's important to bring it up. So in my study of the Hawaii taxation system, revenue system, you can start to understand different behaviors and different things if you start to understand where the power of taxation lies and where the power of service provision lies within the state of Hawaii. So, like I said, economists in the economic literature usually speaks pretty favorably of property taxes, and why is because in the ability to pay principle, real property taxes rest on the idea that there's a strong correlation between one's property and one's income, right? That's broken a little bit here in Hawaii. However, it does still hold true here in Hawaii, and higher income families tend to live in higher valued residences. So it tends to be people who can afford to pay it can do it. And there's this benefits received principle. So this is the idea that if you really value good parks and quality schools, you're willing to move to a jurisdiction with higher levels of property tax, right? And we usually do not think of taxation in terms of markets and decision making. However, it's a very important consideration, right? So one way that people provide feedback to their governments is to say if they're moving to that jurisdiction, or populations are moving to that jurisdiction or moving away. And do they think that the government is providing value relative to the government, right? So I was just listening to a podcast by Elon Musk and Joe Rogan, and both of these are really famous rich people that moved from California to Texas. And they were bantering, saying, you know, the amount of taxes that they were paying in California, they just weren't getting very much value for it, right? More headaches. So they moved to a lower tax jurisdiction that was providing value, right? And so this is not outside the realm of things. In terms of here in Hawaii, it's a little hard, right? Because the counties really do not provide fewer resources and social services than in most other states, right? And the big one, of course, is education. So with education, which is oftentimes one of the largest largest factors when purchasing a home for families is run by the state here, right? So it's very difficult for people to say, oh, I'm willing to pay more taxes in, say, Maui versus Honolulu because they have better schools over there. That's just not something that's available. And I do think, I mean, one of the things you really look at here is Hawaii is a very hard place to vote. It's a one-party state, essentially. And it's a very hard place. Not only is it a one-party state, but it's very hard to say, like, understand how to vote to influence different policies. So for example, if you moved into a place in Hawaii Kai and you wanted to improve the school system, normally parents would just get on the school board there, right? But to get on the school board in Hawaii means you get on the state school board, and it's very dislocated. So one of the like fundamental ideas in a lot of economic literature is you want to have, or especially political literature, is you want to have high levels of accountability, and you want to bring as many services down to the people as possible so they can react and have a relationship with things. And right now we don't. Property tax is a primary way in which local communities on the mainland do that, but we do not have that here. So we'll talk about that a little bit and the outcomes there. The other thing that economists like is property values tend to be really stable. So what you see is the counties are not having crises in their budgets right now. It's a state, right? And it's because counties are primarily driven by property tax, versus here, at least at the state level in Hawaii, we do not have the property tax, so we have more volatile tax revenues. There's the other reason that economists like it is it's efficient, meaning that it distorts economic decisions less than other taxes because the supply of land is fixed, right? So unlike let's say I owned a business, right? I could kind of, and owned a lot of money. I can like shift money around, and I can actually shift stocks around, so it's not all within the jurisdiction of Hawaii that I can hide. However, land is fixed, and it's really easy to keep track of, right? So it doesn't affect people's decisions making, and it's just built into the price as well, because it's not as interchangeable as a lot of other assets, and it's relatively simple to administer. So immovable property tax. So OECD, which is like this think tank for rich countries, ranks taxes in terms of economic distortion, and immovable property, which means just tax strictly on land, not necessarily on the building on top of that, is the least distortive. Then there's consumption tax, then there's other property taxes, environmental tax, personal income tax, and corporate income tax, right? So this, according to their ranking, this is what affects economic decisions the most. Also, there's some people make the argument that housing is already a really heavily favored tax vehicle, so you can tax them in other ways. And the reasons it's a heavily favored tax vehicle within the United States is interest payments on mortgages are exempt, and the capital gains on a certain up to like $500,000 on a house is exempt from that as well. So how do we compare to mainland? And what you see is, like, in Hawaii, it's 17% of our tax collections, and the rest of the United States is 31%, right? So we have fewer property taxes in Hawaii, and that when we go through this, it actually makes sense from a political economy point of view. We also have one of the lowest effective tax rates in the country. Now, this is as a percentage of your housing values, right? So if you took absolute levels, because our housing prices are higher in Hawaii, you know, if you just looked at dollar terms, we probably pay more taxes than some other low jurisdictions like West Virginia and Louisiana and things like that. However, that's because we pay our homes tend to be 4 or 5 times more expensive than a Louisiana or a West Virginia house. The highest effective tax rates tend to be in the Northeast, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Wisconsin, Connecticut. Texas does not have income tax, so they get most of their tax base from property tax and consumption taxes. So what is the relationship between property taxes and provision of public services that are traditionally paid for by property taxes? So let's look at education, right? So education, this is a percentage of state funding. In Hawaii, it's one of the least, right? And so versus Texas, it's really high. So the intuition here is that since the states the intuition here is that, like, since people are not willing to subject themselves to higher levels of taxation because they're not perceiving they're getting a service of public education. That's the intuition, right? And you can see kind of like Hawaii ranks low for education, the share of education on state spending. It ranks kind of low relative to other states. It also ranks low in terms of other expenditures like fire safety and fire safety and parks, things like that. So we tend to underinvest in things, and that makes sense, right? Because things are provided by the state level versus, you know, if most people are like, okay, you can raise my taxes, but you have to give me good schools or you have to give me good parks, right? And in Hawaii, it's very difficult to have that negotiation because everything is occurring at the state level versus at the local level, right? That's the intuition there. Ironically, Hawaii has one of the lowest rates of residential property, but one of the highest rates of commercial property, right? So this is the ratio of commercial property taxes to residential property taxes, and you can see that we're the highest, right? So we place a lot of taxes on our in the tourism industry for the hotels and as well as the shopping centers and things like that. And you can kind of see here that, like, in terms of the number of properties versus the share of taxes paid, like, for example, the number of properties, residential and related, is 75%, but in terms of tax collections, it's only 50%, versus like commercial and hotels is 3.5% and 5.6%, but they make up almost half of the property tax basis, right? So most of the property tax in Hawaii, or about half, not most, I'm sorry, 45% of the property tax is actually paid by commercial interests versus residential interests. So just to sum up, property tax, Hawaii is one of the 14 states in the United States where property tax are not levied at the state level. According to DPED and other studies, about a third of the tax for property owners goes to out-of-state people, and that's because for two reasons. One is out-of-state people tend to own some of the most expensive properties here in Hawaii, and also because of the commercial entities, since about half of our property tax comes from commercial entities, a lot of the commercial entities don't have non-Hawaii ownership, right? They're like publicly traded companies, and public companies have very distributed ownership that's not only concentrated in Hawaii. It's we generally consider it a progressive tax because home ownership is concentrated in middle to high incomes. Lower income people are less likely to own a home. And is we do believe, and I talked a little bit about this during the GET thing, that property tax is usually borne by the owners more than the renters, if the property tax is fixed. So in this kind of just shows you like the rate of rental for income distributions to ownership. And what you see is the renters tend to be here in the lower income distribution, and the owners tend to be in the higher income distribution, right? What is the property tax? They vary a lot by county. So you'll see that the island of Hawaii has usually it does have the highest. This is for in-state owners, and this is for out-of-state owners. All counties tend to tax out-of-state owners more, but still, if you remember from the list, even 0.46, that would put us at one of the lowest tax rates in the country, property tax rates in the country. Like one, I would say, is like average. So that's it. One of the really big concerns about property taxes and raising property taxes is you're kicking grandma out of their home, right? And you definitely don't want people who have really, and this is the dilemma with here in Hawaii, is we tend to have very high property prices because there's a lot of demand and very little supply. And some of the people are not high income earners, right? And so, you know, there's always things to think about. There's a lot of different ways that have been proven around this country to shield low-income earners from having outsized property tax burdens that would basically force them out of their home. One is we have that here, and it's in most places, the Homestead Exemption. So if you live in a place, you get a discount. You have circuit breakers. So this limits the amount of property tax that you would pay as a percentage of income, right? That's a pretty common one. Deferral program. So if you can't afford the tax liabilities, you can just defer them with like very low interest and pay it all at once when you sell the house. And split roll is what we do here in Hawaii, which is you apply different rates to different types of property, right? So in the terms of trade-offs of property tax, the pros are they don't distort economic behavior as much. They are generally progressive. They're a large portion of taxes exported to residents and the federal government. It's hard to avoid and easy to administer, stable. The cons is it's usually the most unpopular form of taxation. And we're going to get to why that's the case. And it adds to already high housing costs. However, when you think about if you raise property tax, and the economists would think that the tax is actually only levied once on the owners of the current owners of the property. And why is that? Because a future buyer will think about, okay, if property taxes are higher, I'm going to build that into my price, right? So when I bought my condo, I looked at like how much I could afford, and I figured out the mortgage, and I figured out all these things, and the property tax was in there. Now, if property tax went up like $2,000, then I would say, oh, I can afford less house, right? So I would offer less money on that house because I would build that into my cash stream, right? So the underlying idea here is when you levy property taxes, it's really a levy on the current property tax owners because they're going to get a lower sales price in the future. That's it for property tax. Do you guys have any questions about that?
I got one, Seth. Hopefully I'm not dominating with all my questions, but I've heard discussions about affordable housing, and one of the proposals to make housing more affordable is to make sure to tax non-resident, non-domiciled folks when they buy houses in Hawaii a lot higher. And as you showed, the property tax is higher, but that still doesn't amount to a massive increase in the cost of a foreign or a U.S. mainland, let's say, person buying a house here that doesn't live here. It's one of the things that drives up the cost of housing here is everyone wants to live here or have a vacation home, and so the residents can't afford homes. But is it only the property tax differential, or is there some other difference in conveyance or some other sort of tax when you buy a home here that's differential between residents and non-residents?
I don't think, and I'll go back and check for you and I'll report this. So this is not, I don't think the conveyance tax, there's a difference between residents and non-residents.
Okay, thank you.
Conveyance tax doesn't have a difference.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I think only you say you're either a resident or you're non-resident. This.
Seth, I have a question too, and it's maybe a little bit of background on, the reservation to the counties for property tax in our Constitution. That seems unusual to me. What's the background on that? You don't have to go into the whole history, but is that unusual? That seems unique.
That is unusual. I know that there's people on this call with longer institutional memories of me and what happened in the 1976 Constitutional Convention. I don't know if Alton or Isaac want to comment on that, but my understanding was just part of the grand bargain that they came to in 1976.
1978 Con-Con
78, yeah.
that got instituted in 1981.
Okay, thanks.
And what you see, like what I see out of the legislature is it's very frustrating to the state legislature to do this, right? So they're always messing with the conveyance tax, which is the one kind of like pseudo property tax that they have over their thing. And it does, and this is my perspective, this is not empirical, but like it does change people's behavior, right? So if like, look at the counties in their response to COVID, right? Kauai does not have, Scott, maybe you can even talk a little bit more about this, but like the fact that the revenue collections are divorced from what the service provider skews your incentive, right? So they don't have as much of incentive or they're not feeling all of the brunt of shutting down their economy because they're still getting money from the state, right? In some cases. And so that's kind of like an example of like when you're divorcing like the services and the decisions from the revenue collection, it actually makes it harder to govern, and it makes it harder to vote, and it makes it more frustrating to the citizens to understand how they want to do and the type of level of government that they want, right? And when I go and I give like my little pitches, the fact that so much of the revenue collection is centered around the state and most of the really essential service provisions are administered by the state and not by the local counties just makes it harder, right? Because like I said, who do you vote for if you want better schools? Do you get on the school board? It's much easier, and it's not easy. Education is an incredibly difficult, complex issue in every single part of the United States, right? And there are big downsides with attaching education funding to property taxes, which the mainland deals with, right? However, we create our own problems, right? And so one is not better than the other, but we do have trade-offs, and you can start to understand. For me, in looking at everything, you can start to understand why people are behaving the way they do, given that our service provision and our revenue collection is divorced from a lot of the basic services, right?
So if Isaac or Alton have any recollections of the discussion in 1978, I am very curious about that too. It seems like it was a lot to give away, but maybe it didn't seem like that in 1978.
No, I really got no comments on that, but if you really look at it, the state of Hawaii really wanted to be more state driven and the power within the state because of having one central government instead of having four because of the islands. And that's the reason why I think that the only taxing powers we gave to the county was for property taxes. And that was the thought behind it as I read the Constitution.
But as I think you said, Seth, and from what I've seen from other state taxes, in many other states, there can be a property tax at the state level as well as at the county or other kind of jurisdictional level. And also counties or municipalities can have sales taxes and other kinds of things. So it just seems like our tax system is a little bit strange the way it's structured.
Yeah, I mean, and this isn't an endorsement. This is just an idea to put out there, right? Like it's more problematic because we're islands, and so it's harder to just move from one island to another. But like for example, even within the island of Oahu, right? If you had 4 different jurisdictions with 4 different school systems, people could decide where they wanted to live, right? Or do you want to live in a small, like a lower tax jurisdiction and with not as good schools, presumably, if they could deliver or not, right? And so that actually increases the accountability of government, right? When people can move with their feet and decide what to do. And we have lower, in my opinion, we have lower levels of accountability here in Hawaii than we do in a lot of other jurisdictions. And that's imposed on us by geography. Historical, the state of Hawaii has a very different history than most of the mainland, and that reflects it. However, you know, this is where we are, and it does help me understand things when everything is so concentrated, you know.
But Beth, if you look at, or if you believe the testimony from the Department of Education, the amount spent on administration of education nationally is the lowest percentage because we only have one school district.
Yeah.
You know, so I think, you know, there's economies that we're trying to, trying to be achieved by having the taxing powers remain at the state and only the property tax given to the county. So, and also the second thing was, many times in the legislature, we tried to give sales tax authority to the counties, and they've always refused. It was easier for the state to raise taxes than the counties to go and raise their own taxes. So that discussion is, I guess it's an every year thing. You know, the state would love to give the counties more taxing power, and of course, correspondingly, they take more of the responsibility. Hospitals, prisons, schools, you know, those are the things, you know, counties usually take care of. In our state, the states take care of those particular expenses. So we have more centralized taxation here.
And just to add on to that, that makes sense, right? Like no county wants to raise taxes if they can't explain to if the citizens don't feel like they're getting better services or more services for what they do, right? So the counties don't want the taxation power because they don't have anything, they're not like providing them anything new, right? So that makes sense to me, that people are always kind of like passing the football and things here.
So I have heard that there are some proposed workarounds that the legislature has conceived or at least considered, such as financing certain infrastructure or housing costs at the county level, but the counties would have to raise property taxes for those areas to pay the state back. Just wondering whether there are any practical trade-offs for taxation that you are aware of or that makes sense.
In terms of considerations, I think like, I don't know about the administrative and legal ability to do all of that. However, I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Beth, I know exactly what you're talking about, but I don't know what the title is. Something finance bonds or something. Let me research that, and I'll get back to you by the next meeting because I've seen those proposals before. I just don't remember the titling or the taxation scheme, but I know what you're talking about. So let me report on that the next time.
Okay, thank you very much, Isaac. And I guess it is no small thing to have a constitutional convention and reconsider this. Is that even anything that you see happening in the future? Is it so remote that you can't even imagine it? And maybe that's a question for you, Isaac.
Yeah, I'll let the
Yeah.
politician answer.
Okay, so let me give you the politician answer. You know, the 76 convention really favored the Hawaiians, so I would think they would not want a constitutional convention. Um, uh, there's other factor. Oh, the unions would not want a constitutional convention. That they were really favored in that 76 the last con. So there is a lot of constituencies that would not, since they got so much benefits out of it, their benefits could only go down. So I can see a lot of pushback for a constitutional convention. Although I think we're supposed to have one every 10 years or something. I forgot what the law says. It's required. And I don't know how we get around it all the time, but we're experts at getting around it.
Okay.
And I'll report back to you next time on exactly how we get around it.
Okay, that would be great. I would certainly like to know the history of this.
Great. Any other questions, discussions? Yeah, so, you know, when we were first jumping on the call, Isaac said, oh, economists think everything in terms of are wacky, right? We have wacky thinking. And there's another way to frame that is like, I just look at everybody's incentives, right? And so when you start to understand everybody's incentives, you can start to better understand their wacky behavior. And this is one of the reasons I like going over property tax is it just, to me, it shows everybody's different incentives, and you can start to understand why actors are acting the way that they are doing, right? And so I'll do this, and this is good. And then we're going to go to tax saliency, right? And so this is a good thing. So tax saliency is how much you feel the tax. Something that's salient is something that you feel, right? And over one of the like ideas of, you know, in classical economics is, you know, people are pretty indifferent about if they pay a little bit, you know, $1 every day versus 365 days at the end of the year. However, that's not how human beings behave, right? And so tax saliency is like looking at things, and there's been some new studies that show that tax saliency really impacts the ability of governments to tax. And when something's super salient, people generally dislike that tax more, right? And so there was this really cool study that showed that, you know, on the East Coast, when they had tolls for all the highways, every time you stopped and you had to pay $2, people would be upset. But once everybody got the e-passes that you just zip right through, they could keep raising them and they didn't even know, because it was just coming directly out of their paycheck, or, you know, it's linked to their direct deposit and everything. And so businesses know this, right? They all get our subscription, and then we don't really pay attention, and we're like, oh, how did that bill get that high? But that also applies to taxes. People are there's another really I'll just keep going with this. So there's a trade-off here, right? Because economists generally like taxes to be evident so people know what they're paying. On the other hand, there's this incentive to show like the less that people pay like a large tax and sending in like one check a year, a large check, they feel it less, right? And so there's common mechanisms to like reduce saliency. One is, you know, you bundle the tax with the gross price. So a lot of people talk about the GET, but when and this is informal services, most people around here don't like scream about the GET because it's 4% and it's on every single transaction, right? So it's very disaggregated, even though in total we pay a large amount in terms of GET. I mean, a nice way to think about this is how much in GET did you pay last year? Yeah, no, how much in individual income tax you paid last year? You probably have a better idea than that. And if you own your home, how much in property taxes did you pay last year? Everybody remembers that because it's 2 large checks and you're like, oh, right? So it's just human behavior. And but from an economist, we should be like, oh, you're indifferent. It should be the whole amount of tax, but that's not how human beings operate, right? And so there's other ways of doing it is like forcing individuals to make computations about how much taxes they are, which is basically what I asked you about the GET, about how much you paid in a given year. And most people don't feel that, right? And so they're more okay with paying taxes when they don't feel it on a daily basis. And so the idea is like really low level common transactions. You're like, oh, I don't mind giving a couple dollars every single time I make a transaction. There was actually property tax is like one of the most salient taxes, right? Because traditionally you send in 2 large checks a year or it's taken out of your mortgage. But there was this really interesting economic study that showed for the jurisdictions that allowed you to pay property taxes through your mortgage, those jurisdictions had higher levels of property tax, right? So I am paying my mortgage company pays it. So I know what my property tax is, but it's not crazy. And so if they raise my property tax, I probably wouldn't even know because they would just raise my escrow account, right? Versus like if I had to send in the checks every single year, I'm a little bit more conscious of that.
So I have
this
to
is just,
ask, I
yeah,
have to ask as a non-homeowner then, are you saying that in Hawaii, people that pay their mortgage aren't paying their property tax as part of the mortgage here?
no, they do that here.
They do. Oh, they do. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so here is the salient. I just went back and looked at the saliencies of Hawaii taxes, right? And I do think it's really, when you guys are doing this, you got to think about the politics too, right? I mean, on one hand, a lot of commissions have recommended taxation of retirement accounts, right? That's a very hard political lift in this country, in the state, right? And when you guys are thinking about tax adequacy, in reality, you have to bring in politics because what we're talking about is all political, right? We're talking about how to balance the values and the resources within the state of Hawaii, which is more of a political question than it's a technocratic question, but it's more fundamentally, I think it's a political question because the technocratic questions are pretty easy, much easier to resolve than the question of politics. And so I just want to, for my mental thinking, I always think about what are the saliency of different taxes, right? And so property taxes are a high salient issue here, particularly because home prices are very sensitive topic here. TAT, moderate to high, right? Because when you check out, you see that additional 15% on your bill and it really drives you up. Individual income tax, I would say moderate to high. Incidentally, there's, the anti-tax movements within the United States, like Grover Norquist, who's like this kind of like famous guy that was, he came up a lot during the Obama administration of like, I think he's like the Coalition for Taxpayers, but like a really anti-tax thing. And every time they move to simplify your taxes so that, generally most people don't really need to fill out their taxes because the government has most of the information, they say, no way, we do not want that. They want to raise tax saliency of individual income because they know that when you have to concentrate your mind on how much you're paying taxes, you get a little bit more, why am I paying all this, right? So it does matter, and tax advocacy groups understand this principle. GET, I would say, is moderate because it's spread over lots of small transactions. Corporate income tax, it's high to corporates, but it's very low to people who are not corporates, right? Even though if you raise corporate income tax, most people, if you're a businessman, you build that into your model and you just decide what price you're going to do. So it's usually thought that consumers and capital owners and wage earners all bear the brunt of that tax. Alcohol tax is really not there. It's low because it's through volume, right? So it's a really hard tax for people to understand. And nobody really thinks about how much those taxes are. So if you raise the alcohol tax, people aren't really, they're just going to see the price of alcohol go up, but it's not as salient. That's how I think about things. So that's it for today's talk. I don't know if you have any questions about saliency.
Seth, can I add a few comments?
Yeah,
about saliency? Another word for saliency is transparency. So
Yep.
let's say you guys get into the conversation of a GET versus a sales tax, right? A sales tax is more transparent because B2B transactions are not taxed, and you tax the final product. So you know what tax you're paying. You're paying 8, 9, 10% sales tax. In the intermediary transactions, you pay no tax. So for instance, if you go to Europe, the price you pay, the price you see on an item is the price you pay. For Europeans, if you say, oh, this costs, $10, and then you go to the cash register and they add 4%, they would riot because they want to see the exact price. And you can tell when you go to VAT states, right, that everything is rounded up. So things like pennies and things are no longer necessary because the price you see, they round it up, right? Everything is rounded up to a whole number. So the price you see is the price you pay. So when you do get into the discussion of a sales tax versus a GET, transparency is going to be one of the principles that you're going to be discussing. Now, conversely, when you talk about the GET, we only pay 4%. Everybody goes, wow, that's really cheap. That's a really cheap sales tax. Well, GET is not a sales tax, right? Because we have all the intermediary taxes that's all hidden in there. And that's why we have a very large tax base. Therefore, we can charge only 4%. But if you really convert that, depending on what exemptions, food and stuff, you can say we're actually paying a 12%, and maybe Seth can do a final number, but you're paying a 12% sales tax depending on what you exempt. So remember that transparency part about a GET versus a sales tax. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. Are you saying that where they have a VAT, that they build it into the price and consumers don't really recognize it because whoever is selling the product has to pay it?
Right, it's built into that product. The price you see on the merchandise is the price you pay. And I know your peers, if they walk up to the register and you're adding stuff on, they really object to that, right? Because the price you see is the price you pay. It's not like you grab the thing and you go to the register and they're adding all these different taxes on.
Yeah, and in that fact, like you could easily figure out what is the VAT on that by doing some calculations, but they don't show that, right? So you really don't know how much taxes. You're like, oh, that's the price of the good. Versus with sales tax, you show up, you're like, oh, this is the price, but like you get your receipt and it's a little higher, and you know that what are the taxes,
But the GET could be treated like that too. I mean, because like you go to the farmer's market, they charge you whatever they charge you, but they don't, at least where I go, they don't add 4% tax. And the merchant could decide that they are just pricing their good without adding anything more because the tax is on the merchant, not on the sale.
Yeah, there's no requirement to break out the GET separately on an invoice.
but
Yeah.
you cannot claim the 4.17% versus the 4%, right? Because so the reason why on an invoice, you have to state that you're charging the 4.17 is basically the portion of the tax on the tax. It's the 4% on the 4%, right? So if you eat it, you don't show it on the invoice, you are you're not getting, you're being charged for that tax on the tax.
I see.
Mhm.
Okay. So if there are no other questions or comments on our presentation today, I want to thank Seth for another really informative presentation and turn our attention to our next meeting. The first thing I'd like to talk about is where we are in this process and what would be most valuable to us for the agenda. Any thoughts from anybody?
I'll just repeat I'll repeat the general comment that I made last time, and it might be really obvious. So sorry if this is a really obvious statement, but given the shortened time that we have, I think one of the most important things to do is just for us to somehow, whether it's a survey or polling or asking each other questions or however we want to do it, we need to figure out from the commissioners what topics they see, at least initially, as being of interest for further exploration for our work, because we can't focus on everything. So we got to pick like a top list of things to do, and however we can facilitate getting those opinions from the various folks on the call, I think is probably the next thing to do.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think like maybe if we all came up with 3 topics or something, and again, to reiterate from the last meeting, I think there's no new ground to cover in a lot of sense. The last, I don't know, 3 or 4 reports cover a lot of action that hasn't been taken and that are still valid, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's a lot of good information in there, and I don't know that we want to or can afford to spend a lot more time doing new studies. I mean, we might want to refresh something, but it just seems like we could sort of, as a starting point, take off from some of the older reports.
And just to give, we are definitely here to help and support you and provide administrative and research support. We are tend to be very busy during the ledge season. So it's easier, we would probably deliver more in May, June, and July versus now I don't think we have the bandwidth to do studies, right?
So just
Well,
one,
and if we, go ahead, sorry.
sorry. Seth, just one question. I agree with the comments that everyone made about there's not a lot of new ground, but there might be one. Aren't we expecting still the carbon tax study to come out any day now?
Yeah, so I read that. I provided peer-reviewed comments, and then they keep pushing it out. Like they keep saying it's going to be out next week. So I haven't seen it. I can send I'll send a email to McKenna to see where it's at.
Yeah, because there are multiple bills going through the legislature right now on that very topic. And obviously, if they make a decision this legislative session, then we probably don't need to do too much about it if they make a decision. But if they don't, and it either doesn't pass or it's still on the table and we have this fresh study out, that's the only kind of in line with what everyone else said, other than the past tax review commission reports, which I agree we should heavily focus on. The carbon tax study is probably the only new piece of work that we have to look at if it comes out.
And I was going to say that if we can come up with a short list of issues that we want to focus on, it would make it a lot easier for Seth and his staff, because you wouldn't have to give us updates on everything that was included in 2017, but only the things that we're most interested in. Now, I do have one other thing that I would like to see whether you have an interest in, and that is the adequacy of our tax system. And that is moving forward, where do we think budget expenses are going, and how well does our current tax system meet the needs that we see? Because, you know, there are a lot of different contingencies. It's not just a straight line. We know we have an aging population who are going to be contributing less in taxes. We have lots of infrastructure costs that are not necessarily covered. Our fixed costs at the state, including Medicaid and interest payments, are always on an upward trajectory. And then we also are trying to cover all of the deferred payments on ERS and EUTF. requirements. So wondered whether maybe that would be something we want to cover before we start focusing in on the few things that we want to change.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, especially sorry, given the deficit forecast in the next 3 or 4 years.
I think the added problem that we recognize from Seth's prior presentation about those massive unfunded liabilities, my sense of it from Seth's presentation as well as the past tax review, I think it was the previous tax review commission report, was that it seemed like the legislature was just sort of starting to get around to allocating more monies towards those unfunded liabilities. And they were just starting to get serious about that, it seemed. And then COVID hits. And so in terms of adequacy, it depends on what you're talking about, Beth, because there's two forms of inadequacy right now. The one that we already knew about from Seth's presentation, the unfunded liabilities, which was pre-existing, plus now this massive one from COVID. And I think it's definitely worth looking at. My quick sort of non-tax guy's view is they're both huge. Probably best case scenario, we could help to address one or the other, but probably, I mean, you can't fill both needs in the middle of the pandemic. So it's probably, I'm guessing the legislature is going to be more focused on filling the pandemic gap versus the unfunded liabilities gap, just because we're already hurting so bad from the pandemic side. But yeah, adequacy definitely is an important topic.
So Seth, can you help us, help guide us through some information that we can be reading, or you just told us how busy you are, and now I'm going to heap some more stuff on you to help us understand adequacy.
Okay, so to me, do you want to understand the concept of adequacy, principles for adequacy, or do you want to understand Hawaii's adequacy?
I'm interested in the challenges that Hawaii has for
Okay.
adequacy.
So what you're asking for is several like resources and reports that would be informative. Okay, yeah, I can
Yes.
work on that.
Seth, Chair,
Yeah.
can I say something? Seth, did
Please.
you give the lecture on debt ceilings, expenditure ceilings, and all those safeguards of allotment and disbursements to the commission? So and then the static effect of our income tax rates, that all goes to adequacy. So did you give that lecture yet?
I'm even then I should be more aware of it, but I'm not as familiar. That's kind of like, I'm much more aware about the revenue collection side. How things are spent is traditionally done out of BNF. I will get you the resources, but I'm not as familiar with those like circuit breakers and things as.
Okay, so Seth, let me give you the citations and everything, and then you can pass it on to the HR. So we do have expenditure limits, we have debt limits, we have static rates and everything that all goes towards adequacy, and actually how our tax system actually works and how it actually increases with inflation and all that kind of stuff, and how it's limited, our expenditures are limited and things like that. So Seth, let me get you those citations and you can prepare for that.
Perfect.
Okay.
And there's also been, just like the Tax Review Commission, there's been lots of studies about expenditure and expenditure growth. So I'll do some research and get that to you guys as well.
That would be terrific. And I can't remember, what day did we decide we are meeting next?
17th of March, is that right?
Oh, St. Patrick's Day. We can have some green beer.
Is it St.
Okay.
Patrick's Day or is it Thursday? I have it as Thursday.
I have it as Wednesday the 17th, the next meeting.
I do as well.
Okay.
Okay, maybe staff could make sure that we have have that on our calendar, that all of us have that on the calendar, because I don't think we would have much of a discussion if you weren't there, Seth.
All right. Well, I might have I might have a conflict this one. Let me make sure I have a talk. And so what is the topic of like, how can I best, other than giving you these reports, how can we support you? Oh, no, great. Perfect. I'm free on the 17th.
Oh,
So,
good.
but how can we support you or what should I prepare for the next meeting? I will commit to getting you those resources in the next 2 weeks. So you'll have 2 weeks to prepare and read over those things. And if there's any other presentation or anything that you guys would feel that you should benefit from me, just please give me a heads up.
Okay. Yeah, I think that it will be interesting to see what Isaac suggested about, what it says in our constitution or in state laws about spending ceilings and so forth. But I think that it will also be useful to take a look at fixed costs and other costs that that are not usually included in what we're looking at when I think BNF has to project spending over coming years. And I don't know, and maybe they do, but I don't know that they are looking at infrastructure costs that have not already been identified and put into the budget. I don't know how they are looking at expanding preschool. I don't know how they might be looking at other things that are on the horizon that are important to the well-being of the state. And we're going to have to pay for them some way.
Yeah, I shared with you that troubled waters report by the Hawaii Economic Condition.
Yeah.
So they do some, it's not explicit, but they do some kind of like 20-year thinking there. So I'll share that with everybody as well. I can go over, but one of the things that I told you before, I'm going to harp on, I'll tell you again, and I'm going to harp on again, is like the, compound interest, or the force of compound interest is the most powerful force in the universe, right? So the difference between it growing at growth of 2% over 30 years versus growing at 5% is a pension crisis, right? So I can show you some like basic math. It's not hard, but the difference between revenue collections that grow at 5% a year versus 2 is the key to revenue adequacy, right? And I impress this on people. Whether you do, most of the revenue proposals that we look at are, a medium-sized one's $80 million. A large one is like $150, $200 million, which is a lot, but that's 3% of annual growth rate, right? So it's way better for the Hawaii to create something that's conducive to economic growth, so we can, and then it's a virtuous cycle. Then you can make better investments in human capital and make sure more people can participate and be functioning members of our society, which benefits the economy, right? So that's always the end game. We kind of like tend to lose focus sometimes when we're like putting all the numbers together to add up the budget, but that's always the end game.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I appreciate the fact that you will continue to remind us of that, because it's really okay. If there is no other business, no other questions or comments, then let us adjourn this meeting at 1:14 p.m. Thank you, everybody. Good to see you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye.